God bless you for being in his house tonight on midweek. And thank you for making the effort to come out, be a part of Bible study. We're going to continue and finish, Lord willing, our series on the 7 money types tonight. Lord willing, next Wednesday, Brother Jeff White will be ministering. So we're looking forward to that and what God's put on his heart for the church. But tonight we'll conclude this series. If this is your first time here since we started this, we started it in June, took a couple weeks off because of camp and holidays and whatnot. But we're concluding this today. We've been using or studying the scriptures with the help of this book by Tommy Brown called The 7 Money Types, trying to take a very practical look, a biblical look at how we handle, and not really so much handle, but how we relate to money and resources, and trying to learn more about ourselves and seeing how we can make this applicable to our everyday life. Aren't you glad that obviously the spiritual side of things is what's most important, the eternal aspect of ourselves, our soul, that's what is most important. But until we get to heaven, I still got to live here on this earth. And aren't you glad that the Bible, for all its inspiration and spirituality, can also be very practical and give us good principles to live by on a daily basis? And so it's kind of what we've been looking at the past few weeks. So this is where we've been so far. We've looked at 5 of the 7 different characters that are highlighted in this book. Each character has a specific characteristic that identifies them and how they typically relate to resources. And so we've studied the first 5. I won't go through the first 4 so much. We did that last week, and we have a lot of ground to cover tonight. So I'll just kind of refer you back to the live stream and the video archive if you want to see those other sessions. But last week we looked at Moses, and we looked at how his main characteristic is endurance. We talked about how Moses types are people that like order and structure when it comes to money. They like budgets. They work best with routines and systems. They're very intentional and purposeful when it comes to finances. They like to plan ahead. But with every one of these characters, for all the good that they have, there's also a dark side. There's the potential for a shadow side, is what Brown calls it in the book. And for a Moses type, that negative side we talked about was that Moses types tend to be a little impatient. They might be prone, or might be more prone to be judgmental toward others, and they might try to look to use their skills at order and their desire for structure to try to fix other people's problems, even sometimes at the detriment of themselves. And so we always trying to find ways to strengthen or accentuate our positives with each of these character types and limit our negatives. So that's what we talked about last week with Moses. Tonight, Lord willing, we'll finish with the last 2 characters you see there, Aaron and David. And so let's jump right into it. So Aaron is next up on the list, and an Aaron type is characterized by humility. So when the people of Israel came out of Egypt and the Exodus first started, Aaron was, and really before the Exodus, Aaron was the mouthpiece for Moses. Moses was the guy who got the word from God. Aaron was the one who communicated it to the people and reiterated what God said through Moses. So after they left Egypt and the law of Moses was in place, Aaron and his boys were priests, and Aaron was the high priest. And so throughout his life, Aaron's ministry was really all about service. His role as high priest, the resources of Israel came through his hands in order to offer sacrifices for the people. He was a mediator of sorts. He was the guy that was tasked with the responsibility of going back into the Holy of Holies once a year to make sacrifices and use the blood of those sacrifices to atone for the sins of the people. And he was constantly reminded that he was there, not just for himself, but on behalf of the people. Because Exodus 28 says that Aaron shall bear the names of the children of Israel and the breastplate of judgment upon his heart when he goeth in into the holy place for a memorial before the Lord continually. Aaron literally wore the names of the children of Israel on his heart when he performed his duties. And those duties mattered a great deal, not only because of what they meant for the people's relationship with God, but also because if he did not do them correctly, it could cost him his life as well. That's actually how his sons died. Leviticus 10 tells us that Nadab and Abihu, his boys, they took either of them his censer, put fire therein, put incense thereon, but the Bible says they offered strange fire before the Lord, and he commanded them not to do it. And there went out fire from the Lord and devoured those boys, and they died before the Lord. What Aaron did mattered, and how he did it mattered. So as Brown says it in the book, quote, the way Aaron handled resources held implications for his own life and the lives of the people of God. Therefore, Aaron handled resources with great care. To misuse or mishandle God's resources was to jeopardize his and his fellow Israelites' well-being. Aaron, Brown says, more than any other of the money type characters, understood the sanctity of resource management and related to resources with deep humility, end quote. So it makes sense then to think that Aaron approached resources with a certain sense of sobriety, certain sense of humility that maybe other people didn't because of how he had to relate to the resources of the nation. So in terms of the core characteristics of an Aaron type, they believe that money should be used as a way to serve others. These are folks who rarely think of themselves when it comes to what they need or certainly what they want, and they always feel a burden to use what they have to help others. If you remember, way back at the beginning of the series, the very first character we studied was Abraham. And an Abraham type is characterized by hospitality. They are also others focused, but there's a subtle difference between the two. An Abraham type likes to use their resources to bless others, but they like to do it in a hospitable way. They like to watch other people delight in what they've given. They like the social aspect of it all. They're the folks that enjoy throwing the parties and hosting the gatherings and all that kind of stuff. And Aaron type's a little bit different. Their giving is not necessarily social in nature. They're not motivated by watching other people have a good time. Instead, they want to meet the needs of other people. Doesn't make an Abraham better than an Aaron or vice versa. Just trying to highlight the subtle difference in that they're both givers, but they're motivated by different things in their giving. In the scriptures, the priests, who again were headed up by Aaron, they didn't own anything of their own. They didn't have land that belonged to them like the other people did. Their natural needs were all met by the giving of the people. But to live that kind of lifestyle, you have to be detached from the idea of wanting to gather and accumulate wealth here on earth. Aaron types are the kind of people who have absolutely no interest in amassing wealth for themselves. They feel like they're at their best when they're giving what they have away to meet the needs of others. So an Aaron type tends to be more innocent towards money. They would in some ways be the opposite of a Moses type or an Isaac type, if you remember Isaac's disciplined nature. Aaron types, they're not as detailed with their financial plans. They may not actually have any plans for the future, financially speaking. They're not intent and intentional about 30 and 60 and 90-day plans and short-term goals to purchase this or that. And they're probably not all that concerned about what they're going to do for retirement necessarily. If they're spiritual, they may have a deep trust in God that he'll take care of their needs when that time comes. They're more focused on the moment and on what's going on right now. You Aaron types stress us Moses types out. But again, that's kind of the premise of the book, right? Not everybody is the same when it comes to this stuff. And we all, no matter what type we all have to find a way to balance our good parts of the good parts of our character with the more shadowy sides of our character type. And we'll talk more about Aaron's shadow side in a minute. But an Aaron type, they're innocent towards money and they're open to adventure. Money really isn't a motivating factor for these folks. So these are the folks who would probably be more willing, for example, to take a lower paying job if it meant that they could do something they loved because they're open to that, the adventure of it all. I think of like the young adult maybe who doesn't really have a lot of responsibilities or things tying them down yet. So on what may seem like a whim to others, they're willing to just drop everything and go out on a missions trip or go volunteer at some relief organization or something like that. They're just open to that kind of adventure. I think it's important to note here that with this type, that just because someone might be an Aaron, it doesn't give them the right or the luxury of being financially irresponsible. The book doesn't suggest that Aaron types are irresponsible with their finances, nor does it justify financial irresponsibility. Brown talks about how Aaron types are willing to do what they need to in order to get by. They're just not as concerned with the future and planning for the future as some of the other character types may be. I just want to be clear tonight that nobody's advocating that you're justified if you want to be a flake with your resources and quit your job on a whim and you leave your family if you have one struggling to survive, or if you don't have a family, you're creating all this financial chaos for yourself because you're not paying your bills and you're destroying your credit and all that kind of stuff. But you feel like it's okay because it's just who you are and this is how you relate to money. And, I'm just kind of a free spirit and that kind of stuff. That's not okay. Okay? Talking about an Aaron type is not some quasi spiritual way of putting a pretty face on financial irresponsibility. You still got to be responsible, even if you're not as into financial security as some of the other types are. But by and large, an Aaron type, they just look at money differently. These are folks that tend to be more aware of and concerned with injustices in the world. They're probably the folks that are more inclined to be in the trenches, trying to find a way to find solutions to societal issues like homelessness or hunger. And they might be the people that even get involved with those things on a social level, maybe trying to impact policies and politics that deal with those kind of things. They are more skeptical of people who they deem as trying to use money as a source of power over others. These are the folks who tend to always be compelled to do something when they see an injustice of some kind. They might be more inclined than others to want to give money to the folks that might be looking for a handout in the medians on the roads. They might want to dig a well in every third world country that needs water, or go adopt every animal that needs a loving home, or make sure that kids have meals over the weekends when school's not in session and that kind of stuff. If an Aaron type sees a legitimate need, they feel like they got to do something. And hopefully we all have at least a little bit of Aaron in us in certain situations, because no matter what money type you are, we should always, as Christians, have a concern for those who might be struggling to get by. But for as good and as noble as Aaron's tend to be, there is also a shadow side, right? There's a dark side to this, just like the rest of the characters. And for an Aaron, the shadow side of this character type is that they tend to be marked by instability. Brown says, and I quote, Aaron types inspire us with their sacrificial attitudes of innocence toward finances, which enables them to be other centered and to use money to meet human needs. Sometimes, however, taking too much of a hands off approach to money or being so inclined to see and support the needs of others causes their lives to be financially unstable, end quote. So if an Aaron type is not careful, they may be too easily persuaded by what other people want. We talked about this last week, but remember when Moses was on top of Mount Sinai and he was taking too long up there, at least by the determination of the people? The Bible talks about how the people started putting pressure on Aaron, Moses' mouthpiece, to do something, to make them something that they could worship. And Aaron caved. He gave the people what they wanted, and then he tried to act like, he didn't know what happened. Like he just put all this gold in the fire and poof, came out a golden calf, just magically appeared. So, and Aaron might be a little too easily persuaded by others. An Aaron type might also be prone to getting taken advantage of because of their willingness to help others so much. And this one is hard because as Christians, you never want to act like you shouldn't help somebody. But somewhere between being mean and cold and tight-fisted, or on the other side, giving money and resources away like it all just grows on trees, somewhere in between those two extremes, there's a healthy balance. And if you're an Aaron type and you're already preconditioned to want to give and help others, that's great. But you also need to pray for and learn how to have the wisdom to know when you're helping people versus when you're enabling people. I'm sure we've all heard the stories, or maybe you've lived the story where you know someone that's always in need of some financial assistance. There's always an emergency. There's always a pressing situation. There's always something, and they're always hitting you up for money, and you're always giving it to them because you're a bleeding heart for that kind of stuff. Every situation's different. I don't claim to be able to know when enough is enough in every single scenario, but at some point, for some people, even an Aaron type has to learn how to say no. Because in your innocent efforts to want to do right by other people and help them, you may not actually be helping them at all. So you got to be careful with that. Remember when Mary came and broke her alabaster box and poured that expensive ointment on Jesus' feet? The disciples, namely Judas, criticized her for what she was doing. He took issue with what he perceived was a waste of resources in worship to the Lord. And his reasoning was, albeit disingenuous, but his rationale was this could have been sold for a lot of money and that money used and given to the poor. The Bible tells us he didn't really care about the poor. He just said that to make it sound like he had noble intentions. Judas was really stealing money from the Lord and he was a crook. But in Jesus' response to the criticism, I want you to notice what Jesus says. Matthew chapter 26. When Jesus understood it, when he heard what Judas had to say, he said unto them, why trouble ye the woman? For she hath wrought a good work upon me. For ye have the poor always with you, but me ye have not always. He then goes on to explain that what she did, she was actually preparing him for his burial. And then he immortalizes her in scripture by actually saying that anywhere in the world the gospel's preached from this point forward, this lady and what she did here is going to be mentioned. But in the context of what we're talking about tonight, that 11th verse stands out to me. Jesus said, you're always going to have the poor with you. Listen, if you're an Aaron, your desire to want to help everybody is great. There's probably not enough people in the world that are like that. But you also need to understand that on this earth, you will never be able to meet everybody's needs. There will always be somebody that is in need for a variety of reasons. And it doesn't mean that we should be forgetting about people or that we should be cruel or rude to those that are in need. We should try to help where and when we can. But don't let your generosity, number one, become your religion, and it becomes more important to you than your relationship with God. And secondly, be very careful about taking basic necessities away from your own family to give it to somebody else's family. Maybe I'm in the minority here. I don't know. I'm not trying to be controversial. I'll just give you my opinion. I take issue with people who can't afford to pay their own bills because they're trying to help somebody else pay theirs. I don't think that that's right. I take issue with people who don't want to or claim that they cannot give to the work of God in paying their tithes and giving offerings, but they'll justify it because they're giving to someone or something else. Jesus said the poor will always be with you. There will always be someone you can help. If you're an Aaron type, though, make sure you're taking care of the things that you need to take care of first. Just a word to the wise. Now, here's something else to consider, and we'll move on to the last character. I've mentioned this a couple different times for a few different characters, but think about this, that if we understood these things and we really wanted to make practical application to our lives, think about how the different money types impact your relationships. So if you're married, for example, and you're an Aaron, but your spouse is a Moses, you're always wanting to give and meet the needs of others, and you're not really all that concerned with financial security or about the future, but your spouse is a Moses or an Isaac and is very much all about the numbers and the details and the planning, think about the kind of potential turmoil that creates if both people aren't willing to recognize, number one, who they are and how they relate to money, number two, who the spouse is and what their relationship to money is, and thirdly, how are we going to bridge that gap, because you cannot stifle the other person. If you're in a relationship where your money is tied together with someone else, marriage or otherwise, but your money styles are polar opposites, the answer is not for one person to dominate the other and shut the other person down. The answer, as is often the case with relationships, is in trying to find some sort of compromise where both sides give a little so you can meet somewhere in the middle and come to some sort of an agreement as to how you're going to approach how you handle money together. But you have to be intentional about that. That kind of stuff doesn't just happen. And if you're single and you have any intention of getting married in the future, you need to be paying attention to how you handle money and how you relate to it, and also how anybody you might be interested in handles money and how they relate to it, because you can save yourself a lot of headaches if you have some of those conversations about money before you wind up getting all wrapped up in each other's finances, and then you're looking for counseling because money's causing problems in your relationship. I'm just saying, a little bit of wisdom being thrown out here tonight. I had a friend, an acquaintance of mine, tell me a story. I'm going to get some of the details wrong, but the gist of it is accurate. I think it was his sister or somebody in his family that was engaged to be married and had, a decent lengthy engagement, and didn't find out until like a month or a week or some really short amount of time before the wedding that their intended was 6 figures in debt. Yeah. You want to have that conversation before you're picking out wedding dresses. Because then she had to make a decision. She had to make a decision already so far down that road as to whether or not I'm going to go through with this because I love this man, understanding full well that once I say I do, I've just taken on 6 figures worth of debt with him. Don't put yourself in that position if you're single. Don't put your spouse in that position if you're married either. Just a word to the wise. Let's move on to the last character in the series, and that is David. David is characterized by leadership. In what is probably one of the most oft preached texts in all of Scripture, the story of David and Goliath speaks to David, resources, and leadership. I know you know the story, but here's the recap. Philistines are at war with Israel. They have their champion Goliath. He's been out there for 40 days challenging someone from Israel to come fight them. Nobody wants to. Everybody in Israel's scared to death till David comes by. He's only supposed to be there to deliver food, but when he hears Goliath taunting them, he's shocked that nobody is getting ready to go out there and fight this guy. So he volunteers, and everyone thinks he's just young and dumb, but he's totally serious, and he has confidence because number one, he knows who his God is, and number two, he already has some experience fighting a lion and a bear, and doing so, mind you, protecting the resources, protecting the flock. And so finally, Saul agrees to let this kid go out there, and he tries to put David in his armor, but David's not comfortable with those resources. And so, as you well know, he takes the resources that he's familiar with, his sling and some stones, and he puts a rock right in the middle of Goliath's head, and he brings that giant down, and then he cuts the head off of the giant, and the Philistines run away in fear. But I want you to take a look at what the next verse says after all that happens in 1 Samuel 17. It says, "The men of Israel and of Judah arose and shouted and pursued the Philistines until thou come to the valley and to the gates of Ekron, and the wounded of the Philistines fell down by the way to Sheraim, even unto Gath and unto Ekron. And the children of Israel returned from chasing after the Philistines, and they spoiled their tents." These are the same people who for nearly a month and a half before this were cowering in fear at Goliath. But David, using his resources and his faith in God to defeat that giant, All of a sudden, David has rallied the people to fight the entire Philistine army until they had won the victory and spoiled their tents. David used resources to lead people in a cause that was greater than themselves. That's the character of a David. They believe that money is a tool that helps create new futures. These are big thinkers. They see the bigger picture in things. They're leaders, and they tend to be leaders in nearly everything that they do. As Brown says it, quote, in leadership roles, David types elicit followers because their goals are inspirational and inclusive. They cast a clear vision and welcome others to pursue it with them. Their financial visions and goals inspire followership and financial engagement because they appeal to a shared interest, not simply to a vision or goal that improves the leader's life alone. David types help others see why financial contribution toward a goal is worth investing their personal resources, end quote. These are folks who are driven by the why of whatever they're pursuing. And they can usually inspire others with that same why. Think about entrepreneurs, for example. I'm sure we've all heard or seen, maybe you've even lived it yourself if you're an entrepreneur, but I'm sure we've all heard about stories of people who have started businesses. And if you know anything about business, you'll know that starting one and making it successful, it's not easy. And there are many of them that get started, but not nearly as many of them are overly successful. And what I've observed is that for many of them that are successful, it's because they are driven by a leader that has a strong why. It could just be that they want to make money, but it's usually more than that. Usually it's something like they have such a strong conviction about whatever their product or service is that they're selling, or it's the family business and it's been in the family for generations and the current leader's not going to let it fall apart on their watch. Or they're just trying to prove that they can do it to people who have doubted them and don't believe in them. Or maybe they grew up poor and so now they're bound and determined to do whatever it takes to never find themselves in a position of poverty again. Or maybe they're just so passionate about whatever the business is, they almost don't even care about the money. They love, and their love for what they're doing drives them. Whatever it is, it's usually those leaders that are driven by a strong why that helps their businesses succeed. Because starting and running a business is fraught with all kinds of peril. There's always all kinds of setbacks and delays and downturns in the economy and all kinds of unforeseen things that you couldn't possibly have planned for. And when you're the one running the business, you can't just walk away from it at 5 p.m. and let the HR department figure it out or the person in the corner office figure it out. When you run the small business and you're just trying to get it started, you do it all. There's a lot of stress in that. But if you have a strong enough why, you're willing to work through all that mess and take on all that responsibility because you believe in what you're doing. David types, they have a strong why. Their motivation is deeply ingrained. For example, when you look at the story of David and Goliath, when David first gets there, you can tell he's not really aware of everything that's going on. But when he sees that nobody is fighting, and then he hears that this giant and what he's saying to them, the Bible says that David spake to the men that stood by him, saying, what shall be done to the man that killeth this Philistine and taketh away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? He wanted to know if there was any reward for taking on this giant. And the reason was David's why, if you will, was that he was offended that this uncircumcised loser was defying the armies of the living God. I don't care how big he is. Nobody has a right to talk about God or his people like that. That appears to be David's mindset. Before he ever knew what the reward was going to be, he was already offended that this joker thinks he can talk about God like this and nobody's doing anything about it. That was his why. And then when he found out that there were some pretty significant rewards for the person that was willing to take this guy on and beat him, that the king would provide him with wealth, that he would get to marry the king's daughter, and that his family would be free from paying taxes in Israel. Where do I sign up? But I believe that all the monetary rewards and the opportunity to marry into the royal family, that was just gravy. It was the icing on top of the cake. I believe his main motivator was that he genuinely believed that if we really do serve the living God, then nobody, I don't care how big he is, has a right to stand here and defy God or his people. That was David's why. And when his brothers started criticizing him and accusing him of being proud and having ulterior motives, David's response was, is there not a cause? Does anybody have a why here? Just going to sit here and let this guy do this? There's a reason, there's a why that nobody wants to step up and fight for, but I'll do it. And then you're telling me I'm going to get rich and get a bride and not have to pay taxes? Bro, let me at this guy. His sense of why was that strong. And when he won, he got everybody else to follow his cause. The same people who did nothing for a month and a half, all of a sudden the giant's head leaves his shoulders and they're all chasing the Philistine armies now. He had a why, and then his leadership inspired others to join in with him. That's what David types do. They're motivated by something that's deep, and they can usually inspire others to be motivated by the same thing. David types are also willing to share financial spoils. When they lead, they are fair with how monetary things are distributed. You can see this in David's life during the whole ordeal at Ziklag. David and his men are out fighting when the Amalekites come to Ziklag, where David and the men had camped out, and the Amalekites burned everything at Ziklag down, and they took their women and children captive, and David and his men weren't there. So when they got back, of course, they're distraught, and they're talking about David's own guys are talking about killing David. They're trying to find somebody to blame. And so David has to encourage himself, and he inquires of the Lord about whether or not he should go and pursue, and God tells him, yes, go and pursue. But when he goes out, there are 400 men that go with him, but there are 200 men who stay behind because the Bible says they were weary. He had 600 guys, only 400 went with them. 200 were too tired to go out and fight, so they stood behind to guard whatever was left. So David and his 400 men go out, they find the Amalekites, they destroy them, they're able to recover everything that was taken from them, and it's a great victory for the nation. But when David and the men get back home, some of the men who went out with David took issue with the 200 guys who stayed behind, and they felt like those guys who stayed back shouldn't get any spoils of the battle. You guys didn't go out and lay your lives on the line. Why should you get anything that we just captured? And this was David's response. He said, no, my brothers, you must not do that with what the Lord has given us. He has protected us and delivered into our hands the raiding party that came against us. Who will listen to what you say? The share of the man who stayed with the supplies is to be the same as that of him who went down to the battle. All, David said, will share alike. And that 25th verse says that David made this a statute and an ordinance for Israel from that day to this. When a David type is in leadership, they look to spread the wealth, not create a system of haves versus have-nots. And then the last characteristic of a David type is that these are folks who tend to have a desire to leave a financial legacy for the next generation. Davids are underdogs most of the time. Nobody expects the little shepherd boy to do anything with his life, and then he becomes king. Nobody expects him to be a warrior, and then he takes down Goliath. Nobody expects him to be much of anything, but then he goes and accomplishes great things. So when you're a David and you don't really have much in your life at first, but then you fight and you work your way and you earn your way into some success, you fully recognize that you could not have gotten that success on your own. And as a result, you have an intrinsic desire to want to pass something along to those coming behind you. For David, this is evident at a time when he experiences the disappointment of God saying no to him. You see, David had it in his heart to build a temple for God. He didn't think it was right that he, as the king, lives in the palace, but the ark, where God chose to allow his presence to reside, lived in a tent. So David was going to do something about it. But though his intentions were good, God told him it's not for you to do. You got too much blood on your hands. And that your son, Solomon, would do it in his stead. So what does David do? Does he get angry? Does he get bitter? Does he get offended and resent that God told him he couldn't do something as noble as this? No. First Chronicles 22 says, David said, Solomon, my son, is young and tender, and the house that is to be builded for the Lord must be exceeding magnificent, of fame and of glory throughout all countries. I will therefore now make preparations for it. So David prepared abundantly before his death. David couldn't do it on his own. So he set things up both financially and politically so that his son could do it when he was dead and gone. David types financially. They plan for the future in a way that looks to see what can they do to bless the generation that's coming behind them. Now, all those things are good and noble, but David types, like all the others, they also have a shadow side. And I'm going to hurry quickly here. For a David type, their shadow side is marked by selfishness. Seems kind of counter to everything we just talked about, David. But again, this is at its worst, a David type can become very selfish. If left unchecked, a David type might use their resources to feed that selfishness. And that can be clearly seen in David's life when it came to his infamous sin with Bathsheba. At a time when kings were supposed to be out in the battlefield, David was home. And while on the rooftop one day, he happened to catch a glimpse of a woman bathing, and he allowed his lust to get the better of him. So he used his resources and the power of his position to compel Bathsheba to come so that he could selfishly fulfill his desires and have an intimate experience with her. And when word came back that she was pregnant, David selfishly tried to cover it up again by using his resources to try and get her husband to come home from war, to go spend the night with her so that it would look as if her baby was his baby, the husband's baby, and not David's baby. But when that didn't work, David selfishly used his resources and the influence of his position again to ensure that her husband would go to the battlefield and die. When it's good, David types know how to fight the good fight and be equitable when they lead. But when a David type goes bad, or when they make decisions from a place of weakness, they're not afraid to use resources in a very selfish way. So a David type might be the person who makes major financial decisions without ever consulting or discussing it with the spouse, all because they felt like they needed something. A David type, who is usually an underdog, might selfishly make poor decisions financially simply because they're always trying to fight an underdog mentality and they don't ever want to be perceived as a failure. David types also have to guard against complacency. When you started at the bottom with nothing and now you have a lot, it can become very easy to take your ease when you've reached certain levels of success in your life and you don't have to fight as hard as you did when you were at the bottom. I can make the argument that that same situation with Bathsheba is a good example of this in David's life as well. Because like we said before, the only reason why David saw her to begin with was because he was at home when he should have been out at war. Is it possible that David was at a season of his life where he lost a little bit of his edge? Where was that young kid who had a why and felt like there was a cause to go out there and fight Goliath? Where was that kid who came from nowhere and had nothing to lose, who was just willing to go out there and trust God and the resources God put in his hands to go and defend the name of God and his people? Now he's sitting in a palace and he doesn't feel like fighting today. And it's in that condition that David falls into sin. And the thing about a David type is that usually these are people in leadership. And it's one thing if somebody who isn't in leadership messes up. It's bad, but it usually just impacts you and maybe a small circle of influence. But when a person in leadership messes up, it's got a trickle-down effect. There was a baby that died because of David's sin. Uriah obviously died because of David's sin. Think about the emotional and psychological baggage that Bathsheba must have had dealing with David's sin. And then another time when David messed up and he took the census of the people when he wasn't supposed to, there were thousands of people who died because David messed up. See, when you're a leader, your complacency doesn't just impact you, it impacts those around you in ways you may not even know. And even if you don't lead in any formal capacity at church or on the job or wherever, if you have a family, you're a leader. And if you become complacent in your spiritual life and your financial life and your health, wherever, the impact goes beyond just you. All of us, whether you have a title next to your name or not, have to consider that, whether you're a David type or not. Your mistakes, they impact more than just you. Doesn't mean you live life on eggshells. None of us are perfect. We're all going to make mistakes. But if you're a David type and things are going wrong and you're in that place of selfishness, you may have the blinders up and not realize just how big of an impact your carelessness might be having on those around you. So it's something to consider that goes beyond just money. So coming to a close tonight, but those are the 7 money types. Not that this is an end all be all, it's just a different way of looking at finances from a biblical perspective. And so as we close tonight, allow me to just kind of summarize with a couple of quick points here. First, like we said before, it is possible that you may fit within multiple character types. If you're interested in purchasing the book, there's the self-assessment you can take in there, and you can see exactly how you score and all that stuff. But you don't have to be just one or the other. It is possible that you may fit into multiple types. You probably have one type that is stronger than others. Either way, hopefully going through this, you've learned a little bit more about yourself by looking at this from this perspective, and hopefully you can more easily identify some of your areas of strength, as well as maybe some areas of potential weakness, and obviously look to minimize those weaknesses while you utilize your strengths. Secondly, I think it's important that if you have a family, you've got to be willing to learn how they relate to money. If you're married, we've talked about it, you need to learn how your spouse relates to money and make room for them if they don't relate to money the same way that you do. If not, you're just going to create more tension in your marriage around the topic of money if you just, think it has to be your way and nothing else. If you're a parent, your kids are still under your care, try to learn your kids as they grow, because that will help inform you about how you can train them to be responsible with money in ways that appeal to their character type. So it's helpful, I think, to look at our relationships in the context of these things. And then lastly, we've talked about it numerous times before, no matter what money type you are, don't forget the general principles. The scriptural principles of living within your means, having a budget, being a giver, paying your tithes, giving offerings, being generous over and above that as you can, right? Don't take the shadow side of an Aaron type and just start giving everything away because giving is good and, your family's starving, but everybody else is doing great in your life because you're helping them. Don't live on the extremes. Find a healthy balance and be a saver. Again, if you're an Isaac or a Moses, you already got a system in place. If you're an Aaron or a Jacob, saving doesn't come as naturally to you. But either way, there is wisdom the Bible gives us and talks to us about. Consider this the ant. There's wisdom in laying something aside in harvest to prepare for winter. Nobody knows when winter's going to come. Nobody knows when the unexpected car repair is going to pop up, or the house expense or the medical expense or whatever. It's good if you can to have something set aside to save for a rainy day. So we can amass wealth and, preach a prosperity gospel? No. So that we can be healthy while we're living here on this earth, financially speaking, and not be at each other's throats, whether it's in our own families or stressed out of our mind in our own lives because we're not sure how we're going to be able to make ends meet. Yes, God's a provider. Yes, He's Jehovah Jireh. Yes, He can make a way where there is no way. And yes, we'll continue to pray to Him and trust Him and ask Him to help us in times where we've done everything we know to do and there's nothing left for us to do. Yes, all of that stuff is true. But like we said at the very beginning, don't use God as your emergency safety net so you can be stubborn and not want to change your negative habits, or so that you can be irresponsible and then expect God to just bail you out all the time. God doesn't work like that. In the same way that you wouldn't let your kids or your best friend or your brother or your uncle or whatever play you, God's not going to let you play Him like that. Right? He's not our genie in the bottle. Not the guy that just comes and fixes everything so we can turn around and mess it all up again. If we apply basic principles to every area of our life, but as we're talking about finances, they will go a long way in helping us avoid some financial turmoil. Doesn't mean we won't have some lean times and some seasons where you got to tighten the belt and all that stuff, and at the end of the day, I've never seen the righteous forsaken or a seed begging bread. And if He cares about the sparrow, He cares about me. And if He told His disciples, consider the lily and consider the birds, they don't worry about what is going to happen. If all that's true, then I shouldn't have to worry either. But you know what God gave me? He gave me common sense. He gave me a brain. He gave me two hands to use them, to work hard on whatever field I labor in, to go out and make a living and to be responsible with what He's put in my care. And if I can be faithful in little, He can give me more to be faithful of. But you prove yourself with the little before you get the much. Whether you're talking about finances, whether you're talking about family, whether you're talking about spiritual things, that's a general principle that if we are faithful with little, God can give us more to be faithful with. And hopefully you can apply that to your life. Let's stand tonight. Thank you for your patience. I've gone a little longer tonight trying to finish. Let's sing a chorus as we dismiss here tonight. Jesus, we're dependent on you. Jesus, we're depending on you. Jesus, we're depending on you. Depending on you to see us through. Sing it as a prayer to Him tonight. We need Jesus. Jesus, we're depending on you. Jesus, we're depending on you. Depending on you to see us through. Jesus, we're depending on you. It's Jesus, Lord, we're depending on you. Jesus, we're depending on you. Depending on you to see us through. Amen. God bless your faithfulness. Remember, Sunday, one service, 11 o'clock, casual dress, kids service, selling lunch afterwards. So don't go to McDonald's, get $5 lunch here. You'll be blessed. You'll enjoy the fellowship. Kids will have fun. We'll give away school supplies. Invite someone to come be with you. It's going to be a great time. Our kids are going to be leading worship, and it's going to be a lot of fun. God bless you. You're dismissed in Jesus' name. Have a great rest of your week.